Number 10. Marathon. The Battle of Marathon took place in 490 BC during the first Persian invasion of Greece. It was fought between the citizens of Athens and Plateau together as one force to defend against the Persian army commanded by Datis and Artasphernus. The battle was the culmination of the first attempt by Persia under King Darius I to subjugate Greece. The Greek army, the underdog in this, inflicted an embarrassing defeat on the many more Persians, marking a turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. Roughly 25,000 Persians against 10,000 Greeks. I'm on Team Greece, because they're clearly the underdog here, and the victors. Also safe to say Greece's confidence skyrocketed after this victory. King Darius the Great and his army fled with their tails between their legs. This battle was a response to Athens and Greeks being done underneath Persian rule. Yeah, they're like, you know what, we're out, okay dude, we're done. So Darius the Great took great vengeance upon the Athenians, which didn't really work out so well for him. Number 9. Thermopylae. Cut to part 2 of the same series, the Battle of Thermopylae. This was fought 10 years later in 480 BC between the Persian Empire again, this time under Xerxes I, and now Sparta under Leonidas I. Yeah, they were still pissed and wanted some more hands, so they came back. Basically, Greece's Navy SEALs decided to jump in this time. And the Greco-Persian Wars continued. Only lasted about 3 days, actually. Yeah, those Spartans, they're good. We're familiar with this tale as old as time. 300 Spartans held off like 300,000 Persians. Yeah, little more this time, they were definitely not bluff. But neither was the 900 Spartans and rebels. There was one path in, which was Thermopylae, and the Spartans did not let them by. You shall not pass! And they didn't. If you haven't seen 300, watch it. It's an amazing movie. Number 8. The Third Servile War. No, not the Civil War, the Servile War. Oh. AKA the Gladiator War. I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. Okay, yeah, we get the reference, but who really was this guy? Well, he was a Thracian gladiator who, along with 4 others, was the escaped slave leaders in the Third Servile War, a major slave uprising against the Roman Republic. The third, actually. Yeah, people were pissed at slave labor. They were done. At first there was about 70 men, then that grew to an aggressive 120,000 escaped, trained, pissed off gladiator slaves. Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying. The Roman Senate's growing alarm about the continued military successes of this growing army led to Rome's army of 8 legions under the leadership of Marcus Licinius Crassus. With help of Pompey, of course, the war ended in 71 BC when, after a long and bitter fight, the Roman legions absolutely crushed them. Yeah, sorry Spartacus. He's a hero though. This rebellion is just one example of oppressed people fighting for their freedom against the oppressors. The Third Servile War was the last of the Servile Wars, and Rome would not see another slave uprising of this type again, as the impact had changed Rome forever. Number 7. The Battle of Hydaspes. This battle was fought between Alexander the Great and King Porus in 326 BC. These guys scrapped hard. The fourth and the last battle in the conquest of Asia for Alex. Yeah, this one took a toll on him. It took place on the banks of the Hydaspes River in India, subcontinent modern-day Pakistan. The battle resulted in a Greek victory after the surrender of Porus. Scraping by, it seems. Yeah, after conquering the Persian Empire, Alexander got cocky and thought he could just waltz into northern India without a fight. The forces were pretty even too. Alexander had more cavalry, but Porus had his secret weapons as well. 200 war elephants. That's the most badass thing I've ever heard. Imagine seeing a giant walking tank with tusks just chucking bodies and horses out into the sky. There's literally nothing more intimidating. No wonder Alexander barely won. When asked by Alexander how he wished to be treated, Porus said, as a king would treat another king. Impressed, Alex, now king, allowed him to retain some of Porus's land. He renamed 2 cities, however, one called Nicaea, Greek for victory, and one after his horse. Yeah, talk about salt in the wound, dude. Number 6. Cannae. The Battle of Cannae was a key move in the Second Punic War between the Roman Republic and Carthage, fought on August 2nd, 216 BC near the ancient village of Cannae. The Carthaginians and their allies, led by our hero Hannibal, not Hannibal Lecter, just Hannibal. One name. Well, he surrounded and practically annihilated the superior Roman and Italian army. It's known as one of the greatest tactical feats in military history, equally one of the most embarrassing by the Romans. I mean, the Romans were good. Literally a walking tank with shields and spears. They were practically unbeatable. But they rushed into Cannae and Hannibal flanked the shit out of them. Yeah, him and a stew of about 50,000 rebel towns and cities trapping the Roman army inside the city, who were then annihilated. Only about 15,000 Romans. Not a huge loss, but back at home, they were starting to panic, and the Romans started doing anything and everything they could to rebuild an army. It's forever known as a legendary and almost divine feat. Number 5. Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was fought on October 14, 1066 between the Norman-French army of William Duke of Normandy and the English army under the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson. It took place approximately northwest of Hastings, which is present-day Sussex. A decisive yet Norman victory. The English army was almost all infantry and had few archers, whereas the French were an even half and half. The Normans did this really funny tactic where they'd pretend to flee in panic and then turn around and flank their pursuers. It worked every time. Most of the blame for the defeat lies in the structure of the battle. William was a more experienced military leader. He liked structure. Basically, when Harold heard that William had landed in England, he rushed south instead of taking his time to build a strong and large army. The English played offense way too much and got broken to bits. Harold's death led to the retreat and defeat of the English army. William was crowned as king on Christmas Day 1066. Number 4. Bannockburn. King of the Scots Robert the Bruce versus King Edward II of England. June 23rd, 1314. The First War of Scottish Independence. The infamous battle between Scotland and England was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The end of a bloody war for independence. Long story short, Scots were like, yeah, we're gonna stay here and just continue to roll our R's. The gruesome wooden wars were caused by the English invading Scotland in 1296. Basically, he was like, bow and say I'm king, or good night. Well, a young warrior, William Wallace, guardian of King of Scotland himself, didn't really like that idea too much, and instead decided to hold off the English forces and was knighted a hero of Scotland. Although the bloody battle wasn't the end, it was definitely the most significant. Unfortunately, like every hero back then, he was also someone's villain. William was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The battles between Scotland and England ended in 1328, 14 years later, with Robert the Bruce securing Scotland's independence and adding like 34 more dialects to the UK. Freedom! Number 3. Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt was an English victory in the 100 Years' War. It took place October 25, 1415 in northern France. The unexpected English victory against the numerically superior French army boosted English morale and prestige while simultaneously crippling France. King Henry V of England led his troops into battle against King Charles VI of France, although he wasn't actually there, because he was a little cuckoo at the time. Yeah, couldn't really be trusted on the field. Lots of knights and swords and stuff, you know? That's all I gotta say. This battle is notorious for archers. They won this war, hands down. The Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories to date. It's a history in itself, as it forms the backdrop to William Shakespeare's play, Henry V. Number 2. Orleans. And again, cut to part 2 of the same 100 Years' War thing. The Siege of Orleans, aka Battle of Orleans, was fought October 1428 to May 1429. Again, between France and England. Yeah, they hated each other. From 1428 to 1429, it was the French Royal Army's first major military victory to follow their crushing defeat at Agincourt years earlier. A true grudge match. A young woman mounted on a white horse like a Valkyrie riding into Valhalla. 17-year-old Joan of Arc, the medium knight hybrid, chosen by God to lead the French to victory. Why aren't there like 38 movies about her? Like really? Under the Treaty of Troyes of 1420, England's Henry V became regent of France. By his treaty, Henry married Catherine, the daughter of the current French king Charles VI, and would then succeed to the French throne, cancelling out the Dauphin of France, also Charles. Oh yeah, the old switcheroo, huh? That chessboard of crowns, I tell you, just everywhere. Months of battles under the divine Joan led France to victory. The Dauphin crowned as King Charles VII of France, the hero, here being Joan, of course, who was later tried as a witch and hanged. The whole hearing God in your head thing kind of freaked people out. And coming in the number 1 spot, Gettysburg. A little bit of a time gap, but it's one of the most prolific and bloody battles to ever happen on this planet. The American Civil War, North versus South. The Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Union versus Confederate. Union Army led by General George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant defeated attacks by Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army, halting Lee's invasion to the north and retreat back down south. Yeah, just to throw some numbers at you here, about 650,000 Americans died due to this war. It's pretty disgusting, but necessary, as the North was reprimanding the South, ridding it, and standing up against its archaic and dehumanization ideologies. The two armies collided at Gettysburg 1863 as Lee and Meade took turns firing cannon after cannon at each other. Lee led his army on a torturous retreat back to Virginia after the loss, resulting between 45,000 and 60,000 soldiers from both armies perishing in just 3 days. The most costly in US history from battles. Safe to say Grant and Meade were the heroes, and Lee, well, definitely the villain. On November 19th, President Lincoln used the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the fallen Union soldiers who gave their life fighting tirelessly for the freedoms of every American.
Number 10, vegetarians. So believe it or not, the diet of a gladiator was largely vegetarian, though it wasn't really like they had any choice. It was expensive to keep these fearsome warriors, and meat wasn't always easy to come by, so they had to fill in the gap with other sources. Based on the excavation of 22 gladiators, their bones revealed that their typical food was wheat, barley, and beans. How they could tell this from their bones, no idea. Science, man. There was little sign of any meat or even dairy as well. However, they did drink another kind of mysterious substance. This study was carried out by the Medical University of Vienna in Austria and the University of Bern in Switzerland. And not only did it reveal the aforementioned vegetarian diets, it also showed evidence that they consumed a health-boosting tonic made out of plant ashes. It can be compared to the way we consume magnesium tablets or vitamin C. It was believed that it helped restore gladiators after a battle. Now obviously 22 is a pretty small sample size, but hey, that's still at least that percentage, so.
Number 9. Death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they are trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired off with an opponent that's somewhat equal. But not all of these gladiators are UFC fighters. Not all of them are Russell Crowe, okay? A great amount of gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment. These prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger. They understood that this was probably a one-way trip, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even began. This one story is haunting, but it makes total sense. 29 prisoners were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all ended up strangling each other. They took each other's lives because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare. That's horrible. The reason this was an easier choice to make was because saying no would lead to an even more painful and still public execution.
Number 8. 3 fights and a funeral. This first point is still up for debate, as many historians are still trying to confirm how this whole gladiator thing started, but one possible launching point for these bloody Olympics was a blood rite at funerals. They served as a kind of violent eulogy, so instead of standing up in front of the mourning families and reading, I don't know, like a haiku or a poem, they fought out their feelings. Healthy. When esteemed aristocrats died, families would hold bouts between slaves beside the grave, like right there. Front row seat for the corpse. This was to demonstrate the virtues that were demonstrated by the dead in life. This presentation of blood in battle also could have stood in for human sacrifice. As you can guess, the tradition would gather quite the crowd and eventually evolved into the epic gladiator battles we know today. Julius Caesar, for instance, organized a massive gladiator fight between hundreds of warriors to honor the death of his father. By the end of the 1st century BC, the gladiator games were state-funded and much, much larger.
Number 7. No heckling. When the Colosseum was built in 80 AD, about 50 to 80,000 fans of Roman combat, they would pour in. The energy was high. This was their only source of entertainment, really. They weren't watching The Witcher Season 2 back then, so you know, they had to do this. So some fans would get so into the action that they of course would heckle. Well, just like a comedy show, they too can hear you heckle. You're throwing off their entire performance, and that's a no-go. Today, a 21-year-old usher will politely ask you to keep it down, but in Roman Colosseum days, you don't get a warning. One of Rome's more violent emperors, Domitian, was pretty die-hard when it came to the Colosseum and the games. So much so that one day, a guy in the crowd heckled a gladiator, probably talked smack about his oiled up abs, or, you know, smile. That's always a fun one, we hear that a lot. So Domitian had him pulled from the audience to the center of the arena, where a group of aggressive dogs finished him off. How terrifying is that? No heckling, ever, even now, stop.
Hey Taylor!
Yeah?
Stop! Number 6, aphrodisiac. The fanaticism around gladiator warriors was like the fanfare around the Beatles, the Stones, and Justin Bieber, like all around, all combined. You might even argue that they were some of the very first celebrities, and that was mostly due to their sex appeal. They were sex bombs. Ooh, beefy men. Yeah. Roman women believed that even their sweat was an aphrodisiac, like Old Spice deodorant. The gladiators won massive fame and even had their own action figures, as children would make their clay dolls emanating their favorites. Their image would be placed on walls in public spaces and even endorsed products. Women wore hair jewelry dipped in gladiator blood or mixed their sweat into hair cream or cosmetics. To have a dream about one was said to foretell a fortunate marriage. There was even graffiti in Pompeii that depicted one fighter who would catch women in his nets at night, like a sexy boogeyman. Ooh.
Number 5, blindfolded. Remember that last scene in the movie Dodgeball when Vince Vaughn blindfolds himself and then still wins somehow? What a moment in time. There were no dry eyes in the entire theater. But what if I told you gladiators would also pull this trick off? Yeah, in order to get crowds to return to these massive death events, they would need to change the formula up from time to time. Sometimes they would have cheap beer nights, which helped, but a new idea that worked was referred to as andabata, where gladiators wore blindfolds during combat. They would also leave the armor inside, yeah, sometimes just battling in sandals and cloth. And you thought Marco Polo made you anxious? They would save these events for the more brutal criminals, so people weren't just forced to, wrap up their eyes and shake their legs into an arena. It was, they were bad, so it's kind of like, it was fine, I guess.
Number 4, women fought as gladiators. This was news to me. I wouldn't do it because tiny. As we might have already established, gladiators were usually built from slaves, warriors, and sometimes even volunteers. Good for you. And apparently women were not exempt from that. Female slaves were quite frequently condemned to face their fate in the arena, though some volunteered because, there were Xena warriors. Some of the time it was as genuine contenders, while some were sent simply for the entertainment or embarrassment. Emperor Domitian, for example, loved to pit women against people with dwarfism because he thought it was funny. Neither the women or the little people were taken seriously, as few appeared to have proven themselves in combat. However, some still did, rest assured. The timeline as to when they started doing this is unclear, but there are records of at least 2 women referred to as Amazon and Achillea. Epic names, right? Whoa. They are depicted on a marble relief dating back to the 2nd century AD, and it says that they fought in an honorable draw. Women also joined in the animal hunts, but by 200 AD their participation ended when Emperor Septimus Severus banned them in the games. Damn you, Severus Snape!
Number 3, nets for weapons. When you're walking into that arena, you're eyeing down this 8'6" beast in front of you. He has like 12 abs. It doesn't look good. His name's Gore or something terrifying. You're gonna want a Nerf bat or 2. You're gonna want a weapon. Now, weapons in the Colosseum were a necessity, of course, but can you believe some gladiators would use nets to fight? Nets. Yes. Yeah, nets, like they're catching butterflies or co-hosts. This class was referred to as the Rhetari. Now, their combat style was built around the ways of fishermen. Yeah, Popeye versus Maximus. Place your bets, people. Realistically, these warriors looked a lot more like Aquaman. They would fight with a trident and a net. They would take their time. They would avoid these mighty swings from these big dudes. And then when the time was right, they would just go zzz, and then they would just poke the shit out of them with a trident over and over in hopes that it would, end. It helps to be quick, but if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know that spears don't always work.
Number 2, are you not entertained? Great title, I know. Fun fact, gladiators for the most part didn't actually try and kill each other in the ring, just like wound. Yeah. Take a second to digest that beside the Hollywood movies you know and love. But the truth was, gladiators had a code they had to follow, and killing each other wasn't a part of it. Why? Well, because gladiators were expensive investments, and seeing your prize fighter that you forked hundreds and thousands of dollars into die in a fight would hurt your wallet big time. Also, most of them knew each other and were besties, so they didn't even want to. Contests were usually single combat between 2 even opponents, and referees oversaw the whole thing. If one got injured enough, the ref would probably just, call it. Often enough, the bout would end after both participants gave an entertaining show and would leave with honor. They were like, yeah, you're entertained, good, we're good to go, right? Cool. However, their life expectancy was still short. Historians estimate that gladiators had 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 chance of ending up dead after the bout, either from being killed or wounded, gangrene, you know the whole deal.
And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Naval Battles. Okay, so I mentioned the Aquaman gladiators with the nets and the, pokey poke tridents. That's absolutely insane, but have you heard about the staged naval battles? What a spectacle this would have been. The Colosseum was once flooded, which I'm sure took a hot minute or two. Then these ships would come out, and then it would be like medieval times, but with a splash zone, right? These ships were designed to resemble these vessels from famous battles, but the bottom of the ship was flat because the water was only 5 feet deep. Can't have the bottom of the ship scraping against all that sand and bones and stuff. No, you'll get stuck. The water was only 5 feet deep, so obviously they couldn't use real ships. It wasn't always violent reenactments either. Sometimes they would fill the Colosseum and nude synchronized swimmers would come out. Nice. Nothing like an in-ground pool filled with gladiator bones. Also, goggles weren't invented until the 14th century, so yuck. These naval battles were doing so well that Emperor Domitian devoted an entire lake to them. It's kind of like Harry Potter Goblet of Fire. They would just go to this lake and then watch these insane battles or performances, Hashtags Slytherin, I don't know. Once the shows moved over there permanently, they then used the floodgates and trapdoors to hide animals inside of. What a nice upgrade. What a show. Also, this is terrifying.
Number 10, lifelong soldiers. From the time they were born to the day they died, men were forbidden in Spartan society to be anything but a soldier. They had to live and breathe battle. How the heck did they do anything else? How'd they get their food, do their taxes, live beyond that? Well, most of the time it was the women who did it, and as well as their slaves, which we will talk about more later. So if men wanted to weave baskets or be an artist, I want to be an actor, dad, be an accountant, or literally do anything else, no go. It was forbidden by law to be anything else besides a bloodthirsty, spear-wielding, rippling-abbed hero of the Spartans. Unless you were an old dude, it stopped around when you were 60. Then you could run the politics and make all the decisions in a 3-stage process. Now some men would probably dig that, but everyone's built differently and you would be ridiculed if you weren't, awesome at your job. Number 9, diet and exercise. Living among the Spartans was essentially like living on a diet and exercise retreat in California with all the hippie moms who were like, it's okay, I can just eat an almond and then feel great. And you could never leave. In order to prepare soldiers for the scarcity of war, they doled out rations that were always just like slightly not enough, just slightly insufficient and very bland. I mean, psychologically, if you are building machines for war, probably a smart idea not to make them used to indulgence and make them resourceful. But they were raised with a specific kind of hatred for anyone who did not maintain their physique and diet. If you didn't maintain yourself at peak physical fitness, then you ran the risk of public ridicule and even being banished from the city-state. But they did drink wine, however they were very strict against inebriation and would even get their servants drunk to show the dangers of it. Number 8, hazing and fighting. Today, we know bullying is bad. I hate it, you hate it. Kids are so mean, like so mean. And it seems to be an everlasting battle trying to teach people not to be to each other. I don't know, it's just really hard, man. Why can't we just all be nice and get along? But in the Spartan world, hazing and fighting was encouraged. It all goes back to being ready for war mentality. Grown soldiers would often stir up strife and conflict between children in order to toughen them up. Those who showed signs of cowardice, timidity, weakness in general, they would be punished severely. After all, there is no room for retreat in front of the enemy. So literally, while you're getting bullied by your peers, your teacher comes over and joins in. Number 7, marriage. Marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today, especially if you are 30. On top of training as a warrior your whole life, Spartan men were forced to be married by the age of 30. If they got married before then, they'd still have to live separately from their wives in an all-male commune. So if they wanted to see their bride, they had to have their mates cover for them and sneak out at night. But it was considered a failure as a Spartan man to not produce heirs, especially sons, back into the population. Now women usually got married at the same time as men, about 18-19, which was typically older than other civilizations. But they weren't forced into it. Both men and women had to be equal to each other and approve of their physical health and fitness of their partners. Spartans saw marriage as a means of making more Spartans, so if it ended up you couldn't do it, you had to find a partner who could. In some cases, both men and women would have multiple partners with multiple children who would belong to all. This is where it gets weird. The night before the marriage, the women had to dress up as men, have their heads shaved, and they were left in a dark room until their man, like their suitor, came into the room and kidnapped them. Number 6. Messenian Helots. So, I previously mentioned that men were banned from having another job besides being a warrior. Though they were educated, they couldn't do anything else besides train. How did anyone get anything done? Well, the women were educated and free most of the time, and completed a lot of the work, but the main source of work came from the Messenian Helots, aka their slaves. The Spartans invaded and conquered their next door neighbors, subjugated them, and made them slaves. They were like, we're gonna go train all day, ladies, we're gonna do other things, you guys are gonna cook, clean, do everything else, while we live our lives. Right. This was totally unique to the Spartans as opposed to anyone else in Greece. Their neighbors were called Helots and they lived in Messina. They became the engine of Sparta for free, sadly, and they weren't treated very nicely. Though sometimes they were partied with. I don't understand. It wasn't a good time. As you can guess, slavery equals bad. Number 5. Spartan women. Okay, so Athenian women were kind of locked up in the house, didn't really have much freedom, but Spartan women were actually against the grain as to what was expected of women around that time. They ate as much as men, which was unusual. They weren't forced into marriage as soon as they were able to, so instead of being a mother at 14, it'd be more like 19 or 20 as previously mentioned. They were educated to similar standards of men. They were active and physically strong, which met criticism from outside societies because they would show off their bodies like, oh my god, her thigh, or she'd be naked, whoa, oh my goodness, like all this stuff. The Spartans believed that the stronger and more intelligent the woman, the better the male offspring would be. Spartan moms were terrifying too. They were really witty and they could like serve you up real quick. Spartan women were also prized for their wit and intellect. They could own and manage property and were proficient in reading, writing, music, and poetry. They were also expected to participate in athletic competitions such as javelin throwing and wrestling, singing, and dancing. The Spartans loved to dance because it showed off the goods. This was also a kind of advertisement to Spartan men to evaluate the mother of their hopefully next son. Child rearing was to women what war was to men. The only way to get your name on a grave was if you died in battle and died in childbirth. Number 4. Diamastigosis. So we know, perfection as a human being was a really big deal to the Spartans. Diamastigosis was one of Sparta's most brutal practices. It was the most extreme test of endurance and a kind of replacement for ritualistic sacrifice. Adolescents were flogged in front of an altar at the sanctuary of Artemis or Thea. It was an annual practice used as both a way to satisfy the gods and as a method of testing a boy's resistance to pain. Until their blood flowed toward the altar, the ceremony didn't stop. The teens who were up to participate in the ritual did everything they could to harden themselves against pain, though some still died as a result. Fun fact though, when the Romans invaded, they actually made this like a huge show and kind of made it like an entertainment instead of just a ritual. It was bad. Number 3. Cryptia. Obviously, where there were slaves, a lot of people not cool with it, not gonna be happy, obviously, because it was the worst. You weren't considered human. So of course, uprising and rebellion is a natural byproduct of treating people like crap. So any teenage boys who demonstrated intense leadership skills would be selected for the secret police called the Cryptia. Their primary goal was to terrify the Helots into submission and weed out any growing rebellions and troublemakers. If they did find any, then they wouldn't even get a fair trial before they were executed. Pretty damn brutal, and follows quite closely the patterns of slavery across the world. However, some scholars say that the Cryptia was also yet another test for the Spartan youth. After intense training, which we will talk about in a minute, they would join the Cryptia, the kind of next step in educational training. Participating in the human practice of punishing Helots was part of their learning to become a great Spartan. Number 2. Agoge Training. I've hinted at this the entire time. Being a Spartan boy was hardcore. You think you're hardcore for going to the gym every day guzzling protein shakes and lifting weights. By today's standards, you go man, that's awesome. But compared to Spartan youths, you'd look like a Stay Puft marshmallow covered in kittens watching Disney movies. Like, that's what you'd look like. You'd be like, you soft man. Agoge was a state-sponsored compulsory education system which emphasized obedience, endurance, courage, and self-control. By the age of 7, boys were sent to live together and their training began. They used harsh and cruel methods in order to harden the hearts of their future warriors. It literally turned childhood into the breeding ground for what would be considered trauma by today's standards. At age 12, they were stripped of all clothing save a red cloak and forced to sleep outside. They had to make their own shelter, encouraged to forage and steal food for survival, but if they were caught stealing, they were punished severely. Among fierce combat training, they were also taught to read, write, music, and everything else. But by age 30, their training was complete and they were expected to marry as previously mentioned. But seriously, I didn't go into really full details because probably YouTube would get mad, but you can imagine, like, beatings, it was nuts. Not a good time. But they were awesome at fighting. Number 1, Mount Taygetos. Upon the birth of a Spartan, they went through a kind of Baptist initiation called Pieties. The infant was dumped into a vat of wine, and if they cried, they were considered weak. This last one is honestly truly the most messed up and super metal at the same time. It's really bad. The Spartan youths were first evaluated by a council of elders. In the event they didn't meet their expectations, the babe was placed at the bottom of Mount Taygetos for several days. If they survived, they were celebrated and taken back to the village. If they died from exposure, the corpse was left behind. The third option was that the babe disappeared via sympathetic passerby, which did happen. The parents had to endure this testing of fate, for only a true Spartan could survive the impossible. This list was super fun to make. Crazy, but fun. My last fact about Sparta is that all the info I just presented to you didn't come from Sparta. Everything we know about Sparta came from records from exterior states who interacted with Sparta. They didn't write anything down about themselves, so who knows what else we do or do not know.
Kicking off our list at number 10, the Varangian Guard of Byzantium. This first ancient army was one of the more recent, so, figured I'd start with this. They were formed at the end of the ancient world, right at the beginning of the medieval period. Yeah, I figured that was a fair starting point, then we'll reel it back a few hundred years or so. The Varangian Guard was made of Norsemen, the mightiest of the mighty, might I add. They all had banded together to guard the Byzantine Empire, the East Romans. They served from the 10th to the 14th century, and they were originally assembled to serve and protect Emperor Basil II. They were made up mostly of Norsemen, but also Anglo-Saxons from England as well. Just the toughest dudes from all around, really. Just people you don't want to fight, essentially. What made this army so frightening, on top of them being comprised of, the strongest Norsemen, were the weapons that they held. Sometimes single, but most of the time they were double-bladed battle axes. Double-bladed battle axes. Uh-oh. In 1204, when the Fourth Crusade attacked Constantinople, the Varangians had to defend the city walls for 2 days straight, until Venetian ships arrived and set the city on fire with incendiaries. That ought to distract and, disturb. The guard was subsequently wiped out, and the last time history referenced the Varangian Guard was in 1395, when some were working in the administrative department rather than the military. Number 9. The White Company. They should have been called the Fright Company. Oh boy. In the 14th century Italy, there were free companies, which were basically bands of soldiers from all over. They were English, Hungarian, German, Breton, you name it. The first unit came together in the 1360s, but when Sir John Hawkwood, an English veteran who served in the 100 Years' War, a knight, came along to lead the White Company, well, that's when things got strategic. More or less. This is when they went from a free company to one of the most elite mercenary armies in history. All it takes is some good leadership, and maybe a couple knights. They were known for their skills with a longbow, and they were also known to attack during foul weather at night. So no, you will not see them coming at all. They were right between two warring cities. So between 1363 and 1388, they would fight with and against the Pope, depending on, who's paying for their services and what we're paying exactly. Even when nothing was going on conflict-wise in the world, they would just raid towns for fun. Again, during awful weather or at night, so you wouldn't see them coming. This is a scary one. Anything with archers at night, that's scary for me. Number 8, Egyptians. We've looked at ancient Egyptian culture up close here on Bumblebee, but we haven't touched on their ancient armies yet. Of course they had to fight. You can't have all this beautiful land and boom as one of the first major civilizations in history without having a few people try and sneak in and steal some goods. The Hyksos people, who were located in northern Egypt, they were actually the first to become organized, and they took over Lower Egypt at one point with chariots and weapons. It was a whole spectacle. The Egyptians learned from this, made their own army, and this time they had archers, infantry, charioteers, the whole package, and then, well, they succeeded. And they lasted for quite a while. We're still talking about them. Number 7, the Immortals of Persia. Oh, there's a name right there. The Immortals of Persia. Let's talk about them. The Immortals were in power from 550 BCE to 330. The Immortals were guards of Persian kings throughout this time. They were profound bodyguards and elite battle reserves. Again, strongest people you can imagine. This unit was mighty powerful, and they were known as the 10,000, because yes, power comes in numbers. They played a significant part in the invasion of Greece, and the team was always 10,000 strong. No less, no more. If one of these immortals were to step out or be forced out, rather by sickness or death, another was chosen right away. So this army stayed strong over all those years. Always 10,000. That's a hard number to keep up. Number 6, the Spartans. Yeah, we had to mention the ancient army of Greece, the Spartans. This is Sparta. What's going on? Every boy in Greece, when they turned 6 or 7, they learned military training and education all at the same time. It's called the Agoge. Every male Spartan would leave their family and then go train with other boys to grow into this full-time ancient army, this ancient warrior, right? It's like Hogwarts, but not nearly as fun. Less magic, more push-ups. One of the first lessons these boys learned was a dance called the Pyriche. It was to teach these young warriors how to be light on their feet whilst carrying heavy equipment. I wish I learned this carrying groceries growing up, would have helped a lot. But then at age 12, then there was the Marakion, or the youth. That's where their physical training would really pick up at this point. Once they turned 18, well then they were full-on soldiers. But all these strict rules were then in place, so they couldn't even talk to anybody else in the marketplace until they were 30 years old. So again, they were training and busy until they were 30. They couldn't do anything. There was barely any freedom. Plutarch was the first to say it, but really the only time a Spartan warrior was able to rest, more or less, was during war. As ironic as that sounds. Number 5, the Celtic warriors. The warriors of Celtic Europe. A lot of facial hair for number 5. A lot of tall lads with long hair and thick beards. Nice. They were fans of being nude often when they were fighting. And to be fair, when you're covered in hair and tattoos and all this stuff, when you're literally a Viking, yeah, show it off. Battle naked. I don't care. I can't even paintball, let alone fight in a war, so I'm not one to talk. I'm not wearing jeans going in here. I would act like Jason Momoa the entire time if I looked like this. Celtic warriors included women. Women would be ranked the same, if not higher. That was the best part. The Romans were thrown off by Celtics. Unspeakable amounts of hornblowers and trumpeters. These jacked naked warriors would shout battle cries the entire time they were rolling in. So yeah, it was alarming. It was pretty jarring. These mighty women would just punch your head off. It was amazing. Number 4, the Sacred Band of Thebes. This next ancient elite military unit comes from ancient Greece. The Sacred Band of Thebes was of course a Theban army made up of 150 male couples. In total, there were also 300 men with this unit. The general Pelopidas led this elite army, and they remained at the top from 278 to 228 BCE. The army fell as a unit later on during the Battle of Chaeronea. They all refused to surrender and continued to fight until the very last of them fell fighting off Alexander's attack. They were buried on the battlefield, and later on, the Lion of Chaeronea was erected over their grave. Later on in the 19th century, when excavations were done to the site, 254 skeletons were uncovered, all laying in 7 rows. Yeah, I feel like we don't hear about this 300 often enough, so had to throw them in this list, of course. Number 3, Vikings. Like I said, I've been playing a lot of Assassin's Creed Valhalla lately, and let me tell you, they're crazy. They are absolutely wild. The first official Viking raid took place in 793 AD. These Viking raiders left such a huge mark on history that we refer to this time period as an age, like we do the Middle Ages. We refer to this as the Viking Age. It officially lasted from 793 to 1066, the year of the last big Viking battle. They departed from agrarian pagan Scandinavia. Settlers and traders rolled up to England. They arrived in Lindisfarne, and then from then on just, you know, invaded hundreds and hundreds of settlements. Not the best way to go about things. English kings ruling over coastal seas needed to start making defense plans from these seagoing pagans everybody's talking about. Everyone had their own army, and they're like, that's just people with beards. It's always guys with beards, naked, rolling up, causing trouble. Why are they always naked? Number 2, the Han Dynasty. Going to ancient China for this one. The Qin Dynasty sprung into chaos in the late 3rd century BC after it collapsed. It was a mess until rebel leader Liu Bang came from Han and reunited the empire. Now it was common for men to enroll into 2 years of military service. You had to. All the while, there's a standing army guarding the northern border, so it was tight. As far as military alignments go, it was pretty secure. The weapons used during the Han Dynasty was honestly fascinating. Crossbows, and more often than not, a double-edged sword. So yeah, it looked pretty badass. So with all this power, the Han Dynasty grew over the following 4 centuries before it collapsed once again. And finally, number 1, Combat of the 30. The Combat of the 30 took place during the Breton War of Succession. This was back in 1351. With many of these armies, they're always made with the toughest soldiers from all around, the mightiest warriors of all over. That's it. So at some point, these battles must have been a spectacle to watch on one hand, right? Like as I'm explaining this, you're like, oh man, I really want to see what it's like to see a naked Viking fight another dude. Yeah, kind of. It's curious. It's interesting. That's why we're here. The combat of the 30 was arranged beforehand. Both sides had 30 champions, as you would have guessed, and they were all made of the best knights in all of their land. The best of the best. You're now representing us. 30 v 30. Then they all decided to meet at the battlefield at Brittany, and then they got it done in an organized fashion, which is pretty odd considering how things have gone historically prior. One side represents England, the other France. This event, and I say event because it pulled in a crowd. Drinks were served throughout the audience. This fight lasted a long time, and in case you're wondering if anyone stood around and watched these epic battles go down, yeah, most likely. They ended up taking breaks like a sporting event. These battles would last so long, they needed to take breaks and intermissions, and like talk to fans and be like, alright, fight's going good, this dude lost an arm, he lost a foot, but we're doing our best. Like a sporting interview, you know what I mean? 110%, you know, just giving her. That was the reality of it. By the end of the whole thing, the English surrendered after losing 9 knights, so still bad. It's still all bad, although it's interesting that people were, gathering to watch.
Number 10, the Jaguar Warrior. Mesoamerica, a beautiful ancient place full of culture, wonder, and civilization. If you're a Spanish conquistador, then the most important thing there is riches, gold. There's lots of gold there. Tons and tons of riches. However, something some folks may not know about is a very powerful warrior the Aztecs had, the Jaguar Warrior. RAR XD. Don't ever do that again, sorry. That's just the worst. Yes, and just as vicious as it sounds, the Aztecs had no standing army, so most men were kind of just trained to be warriors just in case. The Jaguar Warrior was a fierce warrior who proved his salt by capturing 4 enemies. And only then he would be classified as such. Now, why is capturing enemies so important, you may ask? Well, it's so you have a plenitude of sacrifices to make when the gods ask you for some. Oh yes, they do this in full dress too, sometimes even wearing a jaguar skin on their head and their backs. It's kind of weird. Just keep your eyes out for those ones, folks. Keep your eyes out in the jungle, you never know. Number 9, Spartan. Did you really think I wasn't going to mention Spartans when talking about the most powerful warriors in history? Sparta, another beautiful ancient place full of culture and wonder. Sadly, these were times of great battles, and none were better than the Spartans at this. Complete with their Agoge Training, Spartans were bred for this kind of butter. Working as a unit with a group of Phalanx strategy made them extremely effective. Complete with their shield spear and short Zepho sword, the Spartans were a formidable fighting force, and the bravest of warriors. You only have to look at the examples like the Battle of Thermopylae to have this make sense, and the movie 300. I love those painted on abs, you gotta love them, right? Number 8, Samurai. Anime fans rejoice, because I have now mentioned samurai. All is well. Where would we be without the samurai and his katana? I don't know honestly, but they are warriors not to be trifled with, I do know that. The samurai were a unique class of warrior, and in the beginning, they were paid to protect the goods of those who could not afford such services. But eventually they became so wealthy that they became a noble class of their own, and their boss sort of became the leader of a fractured nation. The emperors are still there, but the shoguns, they're the ones in charge. Kinda like your mom and dad at home. Yeah, dad's there, he shows up, but mom runs the show. We know how it goes. They followed a code of honor and did whatever to uphold that. Cunning warriors and excellent swordsmanship, as well as archers and horse riders. They were so cool that it gave George Lucas an idea back in the 1970s to base the Jedi around them. If that's not cool, I don't know what is. The samurai ruled for hundreds of years, with their share of victories and defeats. Number 7, Ninja. The warrior that goes bump in the night. The reason why dudes with my proportion thinks warriors in black cloaks running on rooftops with frog-toed shoes are cool. I know, nice. The ninja, stealth and espionage expert, and maybe the first to do so. The ninja were a group of mercenaries in the 15th century Japan, or at least got their start in 15th century Japan, who rose to prominence as the guys you hire when you need some shady stuff done. The battles between samurai and ninja are noteworthy to say the least. However, the fact that more often than not, instead of fighting the samurai often hired the ninjas to do their dirty work. Corruption, theft, sabotage, and just some good old-fashioned spying. Good old stuff. This sneaking around was accompanied by some excellent fighting tactics and dastardly weaponry to go along with it. The black egg in particular gives me nightmares. It's kind of like when you got something stuck in your eye and you just can't get it out, except it's not an eyelash. It's a little egg that you throw at people's faces and it's filled with crushed glass. Ouch. I didn't even know how you'd get that out in ancient times. There's no eye wash station. So, you know what? Cut it. I ain't part of that one. Ain't doing it. Nope. Number 6, Flama. Here's something new I learned. That's how you know it's going to be a good video, folks. I actually learned something. I know. Flama was a Roman gladiator, perhaps of Syrian descent, or maybe Roman, we're not exactly sure. However, the story goes like this. The Roman Colosseum, big stands with big fans, maybe even some snacks too. It may be a blood sport, but you gotta have some grub. Personally, I'm a ballpark dog kind of guy. One shot of mustard, one shot of ketchup, please. Anyway, I digress. Flama was a very interesting gladiator. Unlike most others, he took part in a lot of battles, probably the most. And like a lot of others, he was taken to become a fighter at such a young age, so he could earn his freedom. So he fights for his freedom. That's kind of crazy. The thing with Flama is that he won 4 times. Won his freedom 4 times. And each time he refused and continued to fight. It's more of a, I'm not locked in here with you situation, you're locked in here with me situation. I'm good at Call of Duty sometimes. That's gotta count for something though, right? I'm not a gladiator, but I can play Call of Duty. That's good, right? Number 5, Alexander the Great. Everyone has ups and downs except for Alexander the Great. Besides a few skirmishes here and there, he was pretty much undefeated. That's a pretty good record. But he was like 10-0, and if this was Call of Duty Search and Destroy, that's good enough for me. The Macedonian prince's empire stretched thousands of miles from Greece to northern Africa, Persia, and even some parts of India. He accomplished all of this at a very, very young age. So, you know, get off your lazy butt and do something. That means me too. I just love being a homebody, what can I say? Although, I do enjoy the odd drinky poo with friends. Yeah. There's a famous quote, and I think this explains pretty much all of it. And Alexander wept, for he had no more worlds to conquer. Tragic. It's hard being a #1 top ancient warrior guy. It really is. It's really hard. Number 4, Mad Jack Churchill. This guy needs to be talked about more, man. He's so awesome. WW2. Germany was back for the sequel, and this time with its other tough guy friend Japan and their little paisano Italy. The boys were back in town and ready to party. Mad Jack Churchill got the invitation and brought some party favors with him. What did he bring, you're asking? Well, my fellow humble bumblebees, he brought a sword and a bow and bagpipes with him, which, if you didn't know, that's ancient stuff. But he brought it to a modern war. What? What's so weird about it? This is World War II. Swords and bows just aren't it anymore. They don't belong there. In fact, Mad Jack Churchill has the last recorded longbow D-Life in history. He has been noted to play Scotland the Brave when the enemy had him in their sights. He was captured multiple times and escaped multiple times. Walking like thousands of miles to get out of there. Kind of crazy. When the war ended, he was genuinely upset it was over. He thought it was more of a game. Hollywood, if you're listening, someone make this movie or TV show. I'll play him. I'll do it. I'll come play in Scotland the Brave. Number 3, Genghis Khan. Sometimes in life you make an impact in history. Sometimes you do so much it's hard not to talk about you. Genghis got to write his own history. The ruthless and powerful warrior from the Mongol Empire. Basically, it goes down like this. You got something he wants, albeit land to camp on, people for his empire, or just riches in general. Now, while he deletes your village and kingdom, you got 2 options. Option 1, if you don't agree with the terms and conditions of option 2, then the chaos of option 1 continues. Or option 2, assimilate into our empire or refer to the consequences of option 1. Ooh, I'll take option 2 thanks, I like to live. But keep your religious freedom, though, for some reason. He let people keep their religious freedom, which is kind of cool. Even for a bloodthirsty monster, he was kind of cool with that. So gold star, buddy, gold star. And of course, the classic fact that he did so much bedroom stuff that his DNA is still with us today, and has way too many descendants than we like to admit. That's just crazy, man. That's insanity. That's insanity. Number 2, Navy SEALs. Oh baby, some real slick frogmen. These are the guys that are sent behind enemy lines and gather vital intelligence. Some of the best. It doesn't get tougher than the Navy SEALs. Finding their roots in the Vietnam War, the Navy SEALs have been one of the toughest special forces the United States has ever seen. They've been involved in almost every major conflict the US has found themselves entangled with for the last 60 years. For me, when I think Navy SEALs, I think of the classic PS2 game. Remember that? Remember that game? I remember that game. It's pretty sick. Let's put that game back. Game was super ahead of its time. And number 1, Spetsnaz. The spearhead of Russian special forces. These are tough guys with a tough history, and ironically, enough to mirror the history of the previously mentioned Navy SEALs. Getting their start as advisors to the VC in the Vietnam War, and of course being a part of every major conflict the Soviet Union was a part of, and even the ones you may not know about. There's also a common rumor that the Spetsnaz trainees are given a pet. Sometimes it's a chicken or it's a dog, not too sure there, the information's not great, which kind of hurts the validity of the rumor, but the point stands nonetheless. Their duty is to basically raise and love and nurture this pet until an officer instructs them to take the pet to greener pastures. Yeah, no thanks.
At number 10, marriages. If there's anything we've learned on this channel after talking about marriages so many times, it's that marriages long ago were rarely for love, and this still goes for the samurai. After the samurai really started to flourish during the Edo period, they became some of the highest ranked people in Japanese society. As we've learned before on this channel, when you are a person of high status, your marriages become more of a political or financial bargain than anything else, and these marriages were usually arranged. This meant that a lot of samurai were involved in arranged marriages so as to boost the statuses of other families. As you can imagine, this rarely went over well with the people who were actually being forced to marry, as many of them would have already fallen in love with other people prior to this arrangement. This unfortunately led to a lot of couples to take their own lives rather than marry other people, which is quite Shakespearean when you come to think about it. It was a messed up system, but when it comes to status, people would do anything to make their families more respected, even at the cost of other people's happiness. At number 9, weapon testing. The katana. Everyone knows it. This was the most famous weapon used by the samurai, and as it was an important weapon, they had to be tested before being put in the hands of Japan's most famous warriors. The elaborate testing that these katanas were put through was called tameshigiri, which translates to test cut in English. This process would have the sword's owner cut through different materials like bamboo, wood, or armor, but there was a darker side to these tests too. The gruesome subsection to tameshigiri testing was called sumonogiri, which translates to the cutting of tied objects. Now, you would think, oh, these tied objects were just things like bamboo tied to a tree or something. But no, the tied objects were dead bodies. Yeah, katanas were being tested on dead people. The bodies that were normally used for these weapons testing were usually those of dead criminals, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying. It makes you think twice about how these swords got their bloody stamp of approval, especially as sometimes the amount of bodies that the sword cut through would be inscribed on the side of the blade. Creepy. Now, before we carry on talking about the messed up things that the samurai did, why not take a moment to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and while you're at it, maybe consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, poverty. When one thinks of a samurai warrior, you don't really think of them as impoverished. I mean, at one point they were seen as members of high society, but there also came a time that the samurai started to see money as, quote, too tainted to mess with, so they made a conscious effort to avoid it. After the Tokugawa shoguns of the Edo period felt having warm clothing and plenty of food would be detrimental to society, the samurai took this to heart and began living lives of poverty. This has been widely believed because people have grown accustomed to believing in the idea of the noble, humble, and honorable samurai, but historians believe that these impoverished samurai could have been influenced by a number of reasons, like their status in society and having things change too quickly for them. Psychological poverty seems to be one of the running theories as to why the samurai started living lives of squalor, because they had grown accustomed to their wealth and power, that their expectations of such rose higher than their actual income. At number 7, wakashudo. As it turns out, the samurai were surprisingly open-minded about same-sex marriage. However, on the flip side, there was a darker side to their same-sex pairings. Back in the days of the samurai, there was a tradition called wakashudo, where younger men were required to pair up with older samurai. They would essentially become something of a combination of trainees as well as field wives for an older samurai. In return, the older man would be a mentor to his young companion. He would train him and protect his companion until his apprenticeship was completed, where the young man would then move up in ranks. This sounds like it could have been effective in theory, however the practice of wakashudo wasn't exactly voluntary. Young warriors were expected to follow in this tradition, and it was believed that if a handsome young man didn't yield to his older lover, then he would be acting shamefully, and this shame would follow him into the next life, resulting him in being disfigured and weak. These young men were being coaxed into this through fear, which is pretty messed up if you ask me. At number 6, ruthless. This next fact about the samurai is certainly one of the most terrifying, so brace yourselves, bumblebees. One of the most messed up traditions of the samurai was something called sushigiri, which when translated means roadside killings, and it's pretty much as straightforward as the name gets. This practice has its roots in honorable duelings, but later became much darker and evolved into a practice where samurai would sneak around to unexpectedly slash at passing merchants and peasants. What makes this a little more sick and twisted is the excuses that some samurai would give in order to justify their actions. Some would claim that they were simply looking to test their weapon, or they were practicing a new strike, while others would claim that they just felt like attacking someone. Talk about messed up, right? To make things even darker though, there was even a legend floating around at the time that claimed that 1,000 sushigiri killings could cure an illness. Sushigiri became such a prevalent issue that it became banned in 1602, but even then it didn't just stop overnight and instead just fizzled out over time, meaning that peasants and merchants were never truly safe from these samurai sneak attacks. At number 5, wives. Now, after learning what we have so far, you can come to understand that the life of a samurai wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows, right? Well, I'm about to tell you about people in the lives of samurai who arguably had it worse than the warriors. Being married to a samurai meant that there was a lot of honor to uphold, and that was a lot of pressure. As a result, there was an act that was performed by the wives of the samurai to uphold their honor of their husbands and their family. Some of you may be familiar with the practice of seppuku, and if not, we will get into that in a moment. But essentially, it was a method of taking your life in an honorable way. This practice was reserved for the samurai, but their wives had their own variation called jigai. This practice was focused on swiftness and dignity and would be performed for a number of reasons, from anointing from her family's shame to preserving her honor in the event of an enemy invasion. But most commonly though, jigai was performed by wives whose husbands performed seppuku, as samurai wives felt it necessary to end her life if her husband had done the same. The women would tie their knees together as to not be discovered in a compromising position, then she would slit her throat and end her life. At number 4, last stand. As we are no doubt familiar, in life all things must end, and such is the same with the samurai. Though they were the noble warriors of Japan for many dynasties, eventually things had to change. Towards the end of the 1800s, Japan was looking to enter more modern times, and with that they were disbanding the samurai clans. By 1877, only one clan remained, and they refused to go down without a fight, and a fight is exactly what they got. On September 25, 1877, the government sent in 30,000 soldiers to fight the last samurai clan, but with only 500 men and limited supplies, they didn't really stand much of a chance. They knew that this would be their final battle, and so the night before the battle, they had one last sake party, and in the morning they stormed into battle. 3 hours into the fight, only 40 men were left alive. The samurai leader had been fatally wounded, and not too long after that, the remaining fighters were overtaken by the opposing force, thus ending the last samurai clan. At number 3, insults. In another installment of dumb reasons the samurai would randomly kill people, let's talk about the practice of killing people who insulted others. These days, if we feel as though we've been insulted by someone, usually a clapback is in order, but back in the days of the samurai, things were a little different and a lot bloodier. The samurai were allowed to practice something called kirisure gomen, which translates to authorization to cut and leave. Essentially, the samurai were given the authority to legally kill someone if they felt like they had been insulted or disrespected. The only fine print to this was that the killing had to happen immediately after they were disrespected, and the victim was a member of the lower class. The initial insult and subsequent retaliation by the samurai also had to have been witnessed by someone else who could back up the samurai story, but the samurai were allowed to use their own friends and servants as witnesses, which seems a little biased, but then again, we're talking about killing people because your feelings were mildly bruised. The only downside that this posed to the samurai is that if they were found guilty of misusing their authority to practice kirisure gomen, they would be given a severe punishment of beheading, and their house would be abolished, meaning that the samurai's son would not be able to inherit the title of samurai after their father's passing. At number 2, seppuku. Now remember I mentioned the practice of seppuku a little while ago? Well, let's talk about it. Seppuku was a ritualistic method of taking your own life where a samurai would slice his stomach stomach open with a small sword. This was seen as an honorable way to die on the battlefield and was established sometime during the 12th century. There were two variations on performing seppuku. One was slicing the abdomen vertically and horizontally, then the samurai would just bleed out and die an excruciating and drawn out death. Doesn't really sound too jazzy to me. But the other, and arguably less excruciating way, was for the samurai to perform a horizontal cut across his abdomen, then immediately following that, his comrade would decapitate him, ending his life. Instantly. Still a pretty horrific way to go, but at least it's a lot quicker than the other method, right? Outside of the battlefield though, when a samurai would prepare to take his own life, he would first write a death poem, have a couple shots of sake, and then perform the ritual. And finally, at number 1, for the streets. Now let's get to talking about what I think is probably the most bizarre and messed up thing that the samurai did. During a period of peace, the samurai didn't really have anything to do. I mean, they were warriors, but when there were no battles or wars to fight in, they kinda got bored. Their swords were just sitting there, gathering dust. So what did they do to fight their boredom? Well, they took to the streets, of course. A number of unemployed samurai from the Edo period took to the streets and formed gangs with other high-born youths. One street gang called the Kabukimono were known for being quite flamboyant, wearing strange clothes and using strange slang, and they would roam the streets harassing people and getting into fights with other gangs. The natural enemy of the Kabukimono was the rival gang called Kyokagu, and they were known as vigilantes made up of lower class people who protected the people. The clashes between Kyokagu and Kabukimono caused a lot of bloody gang violence in the Edo period, so even when there was no outside conflicts, there was still bloodshed.
Number 10, social class. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but the samurai were their very own social class. In the past, and for a very long time, Japanese society was very hierarchical. I think I got that right. Kind of like your high school. You know, you got your jocks, your nerds, your preps, the it girls, the not so it girls, and depending on when you went to high school, a lot of goths. Circa 2003. What feudal Japan lacked in high schoolers wearing black studded trench coats, they made up for in samurai, a warrior class that were above the common folk. Swords for hire, who became so wealthy they formed their own government. But we're still nice enough to let the emperor do his own thing. The shogun is the real boss. I remember that. I'll know that. Number 9, New World. The samurai had ruled over Japan's many feudal kingdoms for close to 1,000 years. Samurai swords and swinging them around and such. However, during the mid-1860s, the world was changing and some folks in Japan were waking up to smell the roses. Japan was in a period of isolation and technology-wise hadn't really advanced as rapidly as European nations. Which if you didn't know, that's not good. This wasn't until an American ship sailed over and the guy from Friends, Matthew Perry, said, "Open this bad boy up, we want to trade." In fear of being an episode labeled the one where we all got obliterated, the Japanese complied. However, they took these new visitors and embraced them, learned as much as they could, and wanted to get rid of their old ways. The Meiji Restoration was the end of the samurai. Number 8, William Adams. This is a story too strange not to be told. During Japan's period of isolation, very few outsiders were allowed to trade or visit. Breaking said rules would result in you not waking up for breakfast. And everyone wants to wake up for that. I love bacon and eggs. Someone invite me over. I love those. However, every once in a while, an English or a Dutch dude would be allowed to stay and chill. One of these lucky dudes was William Adams, who after being an advisor to the shogun, eventually was bestowed the honor of being a samurai. Nice. To be gifted samurai armor, a kick-ass sword, and the honor of being one of them must have felt awesome. One catch though. He had a wife and family back in England. The shogun forbade him from returning. And he never did. On the download though, he did send money back to her when he could. What a gentleman! And speaking of gentlemen, if you like our content here at Bumblebee, then check out our Facebook page to see more. I promise we're funny. Number 7, Divine Wind. The Divine Wind is something you might hear about in Japanese culture, or after a night of eating buffalo wings. It's what makes your underwear cry, trust me, I would know. I know mine does. Besides the cultural connection of Divine Wind, there may be a more literal one. During the time of the Mongol expansion, Japan was looking ripe for the taking. In fear of losing, Japan, like other nations that were succumbing to the hordes, they prepared. However, in the invasion, most of the ships never showed up. But why? How could this be? Well, that was because of a typhoon that destroyed most of the Mongol ships coming in, making defending a lot easier. Thus, Japan was saved. The unusual thing though, is that this was not the first time, but the second time this happened. So people assumed a lot of things, like the Divine Wind was one of those things, and Japan was invincible. I think? Sure. Number 6. A Jedi's weapon. The similarities between samurai and Jedi are pretty clear. A group of highly spiritual warriors who live by a code and worship the sword that protects them. A group that had become very powerful and perhaps lost its way. The Jedi must be defeated. And what's a Jedi without his lightsaber, right? Or a samurai without his katana? These things just go together. I don't make the rules up, these are just how it goes. The samurai had the katana, a blade so well crafted, sharp, and connected to the warrior. One of the ways to test a sword's potential was to lob off the limbs of prisoners, to punish thieves and test how sharp your sword is at the same time. You gotta love that efficiency, you gotta love that. That's good, okay. Number 5, isolation. As previously mentioned, Japan was in isolation, and in the late 1500s, Japan was deciding that it wanted to be a unified country. That meant all the powerful people from all the powerful kingdoms were about to have a disagreement, and by that, I mean they were going to poke each other with some very sharp swords, until the other guy could not poke back. Well, after a lot of sharp poking, there was one dude left. He took power, looked at his country and said, you know what? I like this place. This place is cool, and he locked it down like a bad dance move on the dance floor. No one leaves, no one comes in, and should you break this rule, like I said before, you will get poked at by some more sharp stuff. Number 4, severed gifts. I love painting images for you guys, so please allow me to paint an image for you. I'm just like Bob Ross. Happy little trees. Happy little trees. It's Christmas morning. You scurry down the stairs in your favorite PJs. Dad's already got a coffee brewing and Mom looks very tired. Probably because she made Christmas happen and Dad just signed the cards, but I digress. That's when you see a good sized box. Your eyes begin to sparkle with anticipation. You rip open the 80s wrapping paper like a Wolverine rips into a fresh hunt. You open the box, and there's the thing you always wanted. Yeah, that's right, the thing you always wanted. Let me know in the comments what it was. I couldn't take a guess. I'm curious, what was your favorite Christmas gift? Samurai like to give nice gifts too, though. They loved it, except it weren't Christmas and it weren't exactly nice. Samurai would often take severed heads as trophies, or give them out as gifts, because that's a normal human thing to do. Ugh. Ugh. Number 3, live by the code. The Bushido Code, the honor, the life of a samurai. It's defined by it. Yes, one can argue that without his armor, sword, or bow, he isn't a samurai, but the code comes first. It literally translates to warrior's way. Perhaps something the Mandalorians took from the samurai. Or Star Wars references there, interesting. It's a code of morals, ethics that the samurai lived by. It's something you may find still in use today, actually. I don't have to tell you that Japan is a place with great cultural importance and spirituality. So that's why even today, there are some who still practice or live by Bushido, just with less swords and stuff like that. But it's so pretty cool they practice it though. I think that's cool. That's nice. They're in touch. That's what I'd say. They're in touch. They're culturally and spiritually in touch. Number 2, arts and crafts. The life of being a samurai can be tough, so to take the edge off of life and wielding a katana all day long, the samurai class were encouraged to engage in art, paintings, sketches, gardening, tea ceremonies, flower arranging, rock gardens, all the classic ones you can pretty much think of. In case you guys were wondering, I was never good in art class. Certainly nowhere near the samurai level. Although, I can see myself getting to rock gardens. Rocks are cool, dude. I don't know what it is. Guys like rocks. We like rocks, don't we? Chris, you like rocks, right? Yeah, we like rocks. That's how it goes. Everyone likes rocks. Number 1, duels. You know what I mean? One of those? Okay. When we think of duels, we think of the Old West. It's what comes to mind, for me at least. And you wouldn't be wrong. Kinda just goes with the genre. However, the Old West may have borrowed this movie trope from somewhere else. The samurais. Yes, the almighty samurai engaged in duels, just with swords, not 6-shooters. Unfortunately, sometimes they weren't just duels, but random attacks. The crossroads, as they were so called, is where a samurai could just unleash his new blade in a single strike against an unknowing target. And a lot of times they were non-military targets. That's wrong. Can't do that. That's bad. Before I go, let's look at some comments. I love reading comments. Black Diamond said, keep yourself grounded and don't sniff your own farts. Definitely advice to live by. Thanks, Andrew LOL. Yes, I said that one of the last videos. Yes, absolutely. You want to get by in this life? You gotta stay grounded, partner. You can't be sniffing your own farts. It's true though. You can't be going around sniffing your own farts. You gotta realize it's how it goes sometimes. And then we got one from It's Fresh, It's Ann. That's an interesting name. Laugh after laugh, you're a definite gem and have won my vote. Look at all these comments. We love you, Andrew. Well, guess what, Ann? Guess what? I love you guys back. You guys, oh, I love you so much. Thank you so much for all the love and support. You know how to make a gal feel special. And then Leah said, BTS, the most powerful group in the universe. They may look innocent, but that's until the army arrives. I can agree with that, absolutely. I made a joke about BTS in one of the last videos, but yeah, BTS is one of those groups that, like, I hear the music at first, I'm like, I don't like this. I don't like this at all. Why do I like this? And then you hear it a couple times, and then like you're a closet listener, you know, it's a guilty pleasure. You're like, oh wow, I really like this. And then eventually, you know, a homie catches you in the car at the aux cord, because now you're playing BTS on your way to work and school and stuff, and it's a normal thing. I can't help it, I like them, alright? I can't help it. I like what I like.